Welcome to our discussion on crafting of the Constitution. So first we have consensus. We have a system of dual sovereignty, which is a federal system of government that allows for levels of government. That's why we call it a federal government. So we have the federal or national government, we have the state levels, and then the local levels. And this is eventually spelled out in the 10th Amendment that says anything not delegated to the federal government will be reserved for the states. The Supremacy Clause is Article 6 of the Constitution. And this establishes that although we have a system of federalism, the federal government is supreme in all cases. All right, so a practice multiple choice question regarding that is, the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution states that federal laws take precedence over state law when the laws conflict. Only Congress may declare war. The Senate should have a greater role in foreign affairs than does the House of Representatives. The federal government has the right to regulate interstate commerce. The Supreme Court has the power to overturn decisions of lower courts. Take a second, pause the video, and decide your answer. Welcome back. I hope that you have chosen A as your correct answer. The federal law takes precedence over state laws when the laws conflict. That is the whole point of the Supremacy Clause. Separation of powers is something that we borrowed from Montesquieu. Each branch has their own distinct powers. The legislative branch makes the laws, executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch resolves conflicts over the law. We're going to talk much more extensively about these three branches when we do those chapters. Something else we borrowed from Montesquieu was a system of checks and balances, and this is to ensure that none of the branches become too powerful. Examples of checks and balances are that Congress approves presidential nominations and controls the budget. It can pass laws over the president's veto and can impeach the president and remove him or her from office. The president can veto congressional legislation. The court can declare laws unconstitutional. The Senate confirms the president's nominations. Congress impeaches judges and removes them from office. The president nominates judges. The courts can declare presidential acts unconstitutional. So moving on to conflicts, and conflict always births compromise in the situation that is going to be productive. And this conflict births the Connecticut Compromise, which is also known as the Great Compromise. And if this had not been resolved, any attempts at forming a new nation would have fallen flat. The two plans, we have the Virginia plan, and this represents the interests of the larger states. They decided that they had the ability to have a radical revamping of the Articles, basically doing away with the Articles and coming up with a new document that we would eventually call the Constitution. They advocated for three branches instead of the one we had under the Articles. A bicameral legislature, and we know that bicameral means two houses. Executives elected by the legislature, so that takes the people out of the mix. A separate national judiciary. Congressional representation would be proportional, so based on population. And the people would elect members of the lower house, but then the lower house would elect the members of the upper house. Conversely, you have the New Jersey plan, and this was simply a reworking of the Articles. They did not believe that they had the authority to scrap the Articles and start over again. They called for a unicameral legislature and that equal representation in that unicameral legislature. These are the interests of the smaller states, and they argued that just because they were smaller geographically and population-wise, that they should not be less important in our government. Congress would select several people to form an executive office, so that would not look like what we have right now. There would be basically by executive office by committee. And then the executive office had the authority to appoint members of the Supreme Court. Limits on representative democracy. So this took much of the governing institutions out of the hands of the people. Until 1913 and the passage of the 17th Amendment, you have the state legislatures choosing the senators. And because the Senate is the upper house, thanks to the Great Compromise, and the New Jersey plan wanted the house that was based on equal representation to be the upper house, and that just makes more sense because everybody's equal up there. The people did not choose their senators, and the state legislatures did, so it basically became the Millionaires Club. And that was ended in 1913 with the adoption of the 17th Amendment. And by the way, our senators, Democrats Kirsten Gillibrand and Chuck Schumer. The Electoral College is an indirect election of the president. Before the 12th Amendment, each elector, who was appointed by the states, had two votes, one for president and one for vice president. This often led to conflict because you would have the top vote getter become president and the second vote getter become the vice president, and oftentimes they were from opposite political parties and opposite mindsets, and so literally nothing got done. However, in 1804, this is rectified with the passage of the 12th Amendment, and that fixes that both are selected on a ticket. So for an example, the vice president and the president run together. In our past election in 2012, you had two tickets. One ticket was Obama-Biden, and the other ticket was Romney-Ryan. So you place one vote for the one ticket, and then the electors follow suit. Voting eligibility, states were left with determining who could vote. This is something that has proven very difficult throughout our tumultuous history, especially with equal rights. And usually, back in this time, in the colonial time, and then obviously moving into our early years as the United States, this was property-owning white males who were the enfranchised group. And the enfranchised group means the groups that are given the right to vote. So let's talk about slavery. In 1790, slaves made up about 20% of the U.S. population. In the southern states, they feared a central government that would abolish slavery and thus fought for a very weak central government. The northern states supported a strong central government so that it could engage in both commerce and business. And although they didn't necessarily care as much about slavery as the southern states did, because they were not as reliant on the slave labor as the South was, they knew that something had to be done about this. So we come up with the 3/5 compromise. Slaves were to count as 3/5 of a person, or every 5 slaves counts as 3 people for the purposes of both slavery and taxation, so that we have the appeased for the South and for the North. All right, so let's look at the articles of the Constitution. Article 1 sets up the legislative branch. The legislative branch was on the forefront of the minds of the founders because they knew that a representative body to them was more important than the executive office would be. So then Article 2 creates the executive branch, which we know obviously is the president these days. And Article 3 then establishes the judicial branch. And obviously we're going to talk a lot more about this when we get to those chapters. But let's talk more about the lesser known articles of the Constitution. And then Article 4 deals with state-to-state relations. This sets up a system of mutual respect among the states, a process for Congress to add more states, because they did look back at the Northwest Ordinance and realize that that was a positive step, and they wanted to mimic that in our new document. It prevents Congress from changing borders without the consent of the affected areas. This actually has been a modern time issue because there is a watershed between two southern states that are dealing with who controls the watershed, and because some historical maps have one state owning the watershed and some historical maps have the other state owning the watershed. It mandates that national government ensure that all states are representative democracies. Article 5 sets up the amendment process. There are 2 processes that you can use to amend, that the government, I should say, can use to amend the Constitution. First of all, an amendment can be proposed by 2/3 of the members of both the House and the Senate. And then after that happens, it has to be ratified. And then if it's proposed that way, it can be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Or it can be proposed at a convention called by 2/3 of the states, and then ratified by 3/4 of ratifying conventions in the states. Now, obviously, you can see that that is quite a daunting task, which is why we only have 27 amendments. Article 6 sets up the supremacy of the Constitution, which I touched on earlier. Article 7 sets up the ratification process. And another way that the Constitution differs from the Articles of Confederation is that the Articles of Confederation mandated unanimous consent by state delegates. And you heard earlier, in an earlier presentation, about why that was not possible. So the Constitution sets up ratification by popularly elected convention. All right, so the big argument when ratifying the Constitution, or attempting to ratify the Constitution, was the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. And the Federalists supported the ratification of the Constitution as it was written. Conversely, the Anti-Federalists would not support ratification until and unless there was a Bill of Rights added, because they felt that the government was too intrusive. So let's look a little bit more closely at the Federalists. The Federalist Papers were a series of essays in support of ratification of the constitutional provisions. And it is important that you know that they are authored by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Oftentimes the AP will ask you if you know those 3 gentlemen. And they felt that they needed to convince the state legislatures and the public that we needed a new document and a new way of functioning, not just to rework the articles, but a whole new way to do that. Two of the most popular Federalist papers are 10 and 51, and we're going to talk more about that at the end of this week or beginning of next week. And Federalist 10 addresses the question of how to guard against factions, and factions are groups, and what happens if those groups are in disagreement. And then Federalist 51 addresses checks and balances, because they did want to make sure that none of the branches that they had proposed gets out of control. Okay, so the Anti-Federalists, they were less organized than the Federalists, but they included very well-known people and influential people like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and George Mason. They also wrote a series of papers against ratification, but they are not as well-known as the Federalist Papers are. They basically had a fear that the Constitution ceded too much power to the national government at the expense of the people and the states, and that is why they fought for the inclusion of the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments. The Ninth Amendment is a shout out to the Anti-Federalists, because Hamilton, who was a Federalist, argued that the Anti-Federalist notion that listing the rights to be protected would actually do more harm, because what happens about a right that's not listed? And obviously, Hamilton had the foresight to realize that this country was going to change, and we weren't going to necessarily always need the laws that they put in there. So the Ninth Amendment basically says, if it's not in here, it's still covered. All right, so let's do a practice multiple choice question. A main purpose of the Federalist Papers was to encourage states not to ratify the Constitution, limit the power of the central government, explain the rationale behind the Constitution, encourage partisan support for the Federalist Party, promote the addition of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. So why don't you pause the video and see if you can come up with an answer. Okay, welcome back. I hope that you have chosen C with explain the rationale behind the Constitution. That was the purpose of the Federalist Papers. Okay, the quiz that goes with this, you're going to have to pay attention in class as to whether I've handed it out on paper or it is online, as I am experiencing technical difficulties with the online quiz making. And I hope that you have picked up a couple things about the Federalist, the Anti-Federalist, the Great Compromise, and the 7 Articles of the Constitution.